Thank you everyone for joining us for another Learning Lunch hosted by Format Approved. My name is Wendy Whitmore. I'm the CIO and Chief Learning Officer of Format Approved, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's Learning Lunch is entitled Maintaining HIPAA Compliance, Cloud File Sharing and Mobile Devices. So covering the topic, the important topic of compliance in the cloud. Joining us today is Atsaf Sidan, the CEO of Sookasa. He's an innovator in data protection and compliance for cloud services and mobile devices. Atsaf was previously at the Stanford Computer Systems Lab, where he published award-winning research in cloud and mobile systems, so we thought he would be the perfect person to help us with this important topic today.
So, Saf, let's get started with a little background. How has the whole cloud-based file sharing concept taken off over the last couple of years?
So it's taken off in a really unprecedented ways. I think I don't know how much of the audience is familiar with various file sharing solutions, but there seems to be a new one every week that goes by, and the most popular ones like Dropbox and Google Drive have just picked up steam faster and faster. I think the really interesting trend that we're seeing is that these services aren't just consumer services. So, they've grown a lot, very, very popular among consumers or people just trying to store their own data, but we're seeing them more and more in professional use cases and even in highly regulated industries like healthcare. And so if you look at a service like Dropbox, today there's thousands and tens of thousands of healthcare organizations actually using this tool to share and back up data. And so we think that these tools are here to stay and actually will become kind of a backbone for a lot of healthcare providers and business associates when they deliver their services.
Interesting. And from your perspective, these new services that are kind of popping up day in and day out, are they all similar in terms of their functionality, or are there some differences?
So from a high level, they sound similar, and I think that's where there's a lot of confusion. But in practice, they're a little bit different. I think each one of these services has its own advantages and disadvantages, or even specific kind of use cases where they're where they're being used more frequently. So for example, Dropbox is really, I think, the standard, set the standard for any kind of desktop, working, file editing, syncing, backup. We know that Google Drive has the integration with Google Docs, so that's really good for real-time collaboration with a small group of people. And then Box today is becoming more popular, usually with larger companies. So when, let's say, maybe more in a hospital setting and healthcare, or in, let's say, pharma companies, where they have very, very large amounts of documents that they need to put in a centralized file share or share externally, Box seems to be the industry leader in those types of use cases.
Great, I appreciate that. In terms of the cloud services that you're mentioning, how do they help in terms of the syncing and backing up of data, particularly healthcare data?
Sure. So I think what we've seen is a lot of organizations view these services as a kind of a one-stop shop, right? So they both make sure that, so when we say sync, what we mean is they basically make data available anywhere you need it, right? So the idea is, imagine you have transcriptions or patient charts or medical bills. What will happen with these services is you'll basically usually get a folder into which you can just drop a bunch of data. And then this cloud service will make sure that this folder is available on any one of your devices or on any of the devices of the people that you share with. So let's say your close team or business associates. And the second thing that this service will do is make sure that this data is backed up. So if you, let's say, if your hard disk gets fried and starts, and the data isn't recoverable, you'll always be able to go to the cloud service and get the latest version of the data from there. And what I think has become part of the reason that these services are so popular is simply their incredibly low price, right? So it's $100 to $200 per seat, pretty much across the board with all of these services. And when you compare that with the alternatives, which would be to set up your own file share or set up your own kind of backup or disaster recovery system, the costs in those types of services just to install, maintain, and support them could be thousands of dollars and $10,000s of dollars per year for a smaller organization. I think that's kind of why these services have partly become so popular.
And out of curiosity, when you say $100 to $200 a seat, you're talking about annually?
Yeah.
Okay, so annually, and when you say per seat, and I don't mean to sound like a neophyte, but I do know our audience, and I do know that they will want to know what you mean by per seat. Is that per workstation, per site? What's generally your designation there?
So generally, the designation today is per person, typically where that one person would have a large number of devices. So this would be per one person using the product.
Gotcha. Okay. And when you're talking about for sync and backup of transcriptions, patient charts, we're talking about versions of these services or sync and backup that is compliant, correct? And we're gonna get into that.
Right. So part of the challenge, of course, is so these services will give you the kind of underlying way to do sync and backup. What we'll talk about during this presentation, right, is how do we also make sure, of course, that data is secure and compliant. So those are the two parts that we will need to figure out.
Okay, great. So in the cloud file sharing world, you know, how are we doing this? There's so much use of mobile devices. I know that actually the mobile devices have become a common tool for medical providers to access records and to communicate back and forth. You know, obviously the fear or the concern on a number of levels is, you know, how does that create risk or of breach, and how do we do that in a better way using some of these tools?
Sure. No, so first of all, I think before we go into the breaches, right, I think mobile is kind of revolutionizing, you know, a lot of different industries and healthcare in particular. We're seeing mobile being used to, you know, for a lot of different use cases, whether it's you know, accessing healthcare information on the go, you know, while traveling or working from remote sites. We're seeing more and more healthcare providers access their data from home. And of course, I think one of the best examples of this is just the whole field of home care that has been exploding. And so all of these services really enable that, right? Like what they do is they make sure that your data is available on all your mobile devices, so that let's say even if you take your phone on, you know, on a plane, or if you take it remotely or a tablet, the data is always going to be there. Of course, I agree with you. I think part of the biggest concern now with the mobile access is breaches, the increased exposure to breaches, and how we can protect ourselves from those types of scenarios.
Gotcha. In terms of the cloud itself, you know, obviously we're talking about tools like Dropbox, which, you know, allow you to throw things up in there and both store and share and exchange information. Obviously that makes all of that very convenient for the medical community, and they all appreciate having that service. But of course the big fear is that with that external file sharing, there's some risk that it's not protected. So can you talk about that a little bit? How does the cloud help with that file sharing, and you know, how are we using that more effectively?
Sure. So I think yeah, this is a problem that has plagued the healthcare industry for many years, especially so. You know, if any of you are familiar with hospitals, right, and EHR systems, it's the classic problem of you have two HR systems on different hospitals, and they simply can't talk to each other, right? And it's becoming extremely difficult to pass data across medical organizations, whether it's images, bills, receipts, referrals, second opinions. It's all of these systems are typically proprietary and closed, and they just don't talk to each other. And so if you look at something like Dropbox as an example, it's a matter of 2 clicks of a button, right? Both of the organizations have a Dropbox account. They create a shared folder. Then you can drop out that big file, the CT scan, or the images or the medical bills into that folder, and kind of boom, it appears on both ends. And so we're seeing more and more organizations relying on these types of file sharing tools to really share across organizations, and kind of get rid of the fax machine, the having to burn a DVD with a CT scan and have someone manually every day send it over. These are true stories. And kind of just shift to a completely digital approach where the data is always there and available for the providers or the business associates. And of course, again, I think that with any type of sharing, I think the tricky part is because you're sharing data externally, PHI externally, you need to make sure that the data is not only safe in your organization, but you have a responsibility to also maintain and the safety of the data after it's been shared with your business associate or with a second provider. And so that's also a very big challenge now around these file sharing services, and we'll talk about how maybe we can solve that.
Well, it's interesting. I just had a couple of stories come through to me over the past month or so that were similar, and so this is kind of an interesting area for me. Not only do we get this question quite a bit, but the assumption that faxing, for instance, is so much safer than cloud file sharing is really not true. In a couple of instances this month, it was reported to us that folks had sent or faxed from medical offices records to the wrong fax number. And actually that happened. It's fascinating to me that faxes are still being used in this way, but more interesting is the idea that you can easily fax to the wrong phone number, which within the past month has been reported to me more than once, and I do find it interesting that people think somehow because it is going through a phone line to a personal fax machine or an individual fax machine, that somehow that's safer. I don't really think it is.
No, I agree with you. I mean, and that piece of paper after, or that that fax, transmission after it's left your organization. I mean, it's out in the wild, right? I mean, it's very, very hard to. First, I agree. You can make a mistake. You can send it to the wrong person. It could be intercepted, and then someone is going to print it out and put it somewhere, and you have no way to guarantee who can and cannot view it. And a lot. I mean, I think we'll talk during this presentation about breaches, HIPAA breaches, but paper breaches have been around for a long time. So it's definitely a concern, and we see it a lot, with our own customers.
Right, exactly. And I think, the other thing from a technology standpoint is, when you've lost track of a piece of paper, pretty hard to track down. Whereas if you've got a digital file, there's a lot of tracking information there, a little bit easier to potentially grab hold of out in the ether. So I do think there's some safety components kind of built into the nature of digital filing.
There is, if it's done correctly. I agree.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. The dark side, what's the dark side of the cloud? Obviously there are a number of instances, have been a number of instances of issues surrounding breach in these cloud service transfers and file sharing. What's your backstory on that?
Right. So I think the dark side of these services. A lot of people are really concerned about putting their data in the cloud, right? That's kind of the first concern that pops up, and that's a big concern. But I think the biggest concern that's sometimes overlooked is even if the cloud service is extremely secure and is a trusted partner, one of the things that we need to think about is, let's say we put a bunch of data on something like Dropbox or Box or Google Drive, right? Well, let's say we put I have a small medical office with 10 people, and we place all of our, our patient charts onto it. what will happen is this cloud service won't just keep a copy of the data on the cloud, on their servers. They will also maintain and synchronize copies of the data on every one of my office mates' devices. So on every one of their laptops, phones, tablets. And if my office is even just 10 people, right, it just takes one person that will, let's say, forget their smartphone in a bar, or maybe have their car broken into while their laptop was in there, and you're suddenly facing the risk of a catastrophic data breach, right? And so I think what's happening today is all these services, they're kind of pushing data into all your devices, and because each one of us owns a bunch of devices, we're suddenly, it's kind of a ticking time bomb. And so that's really the dark side of the cloud, is that if you're not careful, you could actually be exposing yourself to even greater risk than before.
Right, because the distribution is much wider. And
exactly.
Yeah, and you're right. The mobile component does add a level of concern, because people carry those with them and out of the office. There was one of my colleagues reported being on an airplane and sitting in the row behind a gentleman that was using a laptop to look at patient records, and realized that he could see all of the details of that patient record through the crack in the seats on the airplane. And those are the kind of sort of ridiculous things that I think most practitioners don't really think about when they're using those mobile devices and accessing patient records, and they're not really thinking about anything other than kind of their immediate surroundings. And so I think, more mindfulness is clearly the key to this, on top of figuring out ways to protect through these services a bit better.
I agree. No, and just to add to that, I mean, at the end of the day, right, these mobile devices, they're here to stay. I mean,
oh, yeah.
The idea that you can try to force, entire organizations to not to use them, or just to use, desktop servers and stuff like that. I mean, it's at the end, I mean, mobile is becoming an important way we work. So I think what we all need to do is find ways to not to try to block these services, but really try to make them, make them secure and enable them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a new problem. It's a relatively new problem. And I say that because, having worked in a consulting firm that was connected to healthcare institutions for years, my awareness of kind of the technical savvy practitioner has really only grown over the past year or so. I mean, there really was a lag in the healthcare industry to become technically competent and comfortable, and I think that has affected how well this migration to the mobile universe has happened in healthcare. What's interesting to me about this list, and this is a slide talking about the sources of breach affecting a number of patient records over the last several years. I'm fascinated to see EMR in here. Doesn't everybody believe the EMR is going to protect their patient records?
No, by the way, I think that just highlights the fact that even if you have the best security, tools in place, or even your EMR is kind of a relatively secure place for your data, as we all know, HIPAA is not just about the technologies or about the tools you have in place. It's also about policies. And so a lot of these breaches are also because people make mistakes. Even if the tool is very secure, they could still make mistakes. And I think that's a great point. I think even, and we've seen this with a bunch of organizations, right? They will adopt, mobile devices. They'll have the state-of-the-art EMRs, and they will kind of try to make sure that all of them are secure, and they have, and kind of try to set policies, and still, sometimes people will make mistakes, and I think organizations have to be vigilant, but also try to find ways that just simply reduce human error. And so if you can choose tools that still enable productivity and kind of collaboration, but on the other hand, really reduce the risk of a breach, that would be kind of the golden standard, I think, for healthcare.
Yes, I absolutely agreed. But this is a pretty interesting breakdown of kind of how these breaches happen and how and where they happen. Certainly, the bulk of the breach activity that I see reported over the last 6-8 months has definitely been in the portable media universe. Those flash drives and portable backup drives and things like that go missing or get lost unencrypted. And the idea that had either of those things been encrypted, that breach would not have happened and those fines would not have been imposed. And it's pretty amazing given that everyone in the entire medical community is required to take HIPAA training on an annual basis, and that many patient record breaches can happen in a very simple way, on a very simple, portable something or other.
No, I agree, and I think what this, this is. I mean, what this highlights really is that this problem of losing, a portable media or a device or a laptop has been a big problem in the last few years, right? That's been kind of what the number one cause of HIPAA breaches. Mm-hmm. But then if we look forward, and now we have these mobile devices like smartphones, right? So this list doesn't really take into account the rise of smartphones, right? But imagine that now you have all these smartphones and tablets and so forth that a lot of the providers offer their employees, and each one of these devices now is connected to a cloud service that is synchronizing hundreds of gigabytes of data into each one of these devices. If we extrapolate the past into the future, we kind of believe that in the future a lot of these breaches are going to be around these lost or stolen smart devices that have a lot of data on them. And that's it's a bit of a ticking time bomb. I think that those are the types of breaches that a lot of organizations are going to face and are going to have to figure out policies and technologies that help them deal with it.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're right. I think because we're talking about dates through, I think, 2013 on this chart, you're looking at probably flash drives for the most part, and portable backup drives and things like that in that big blue 46%. But as time goes on between last year and this year, I would imagine that the bulk are moving into that kind of portable phone and tablet space as well.
I agree.
So in terms of, obviously we are addressing the mobile universe here, why do you think the mobile devices are more often have more breach potential? Obviously we've answered that a little bit, and that simply you've got it in your pocket and then you don't. Obviously that's one reason. But clearly, as I mentioned about that one particular case, if you had something in your phone that was protecting you, or protecting the data, that would solve that problem, correct or incorrect?
Correct. I mean, of course, it depends what. But in general, I think if you had a convenient way, right, to make sure that if someone, let's say I was going out for a drink in a bar and I left my smartphone in that bar and someone picked it up. Or someone took out the flash drive of that phone, we'd want to make sure that the person that just picked it up would not be able to open any of the files, even if they just grabbed a hold of a bunch of files, that they wouldn't be able to open any of them. Also, by the way, we'd want to make sure that we had an audit trail of that, right? So the whole idea of an audit trail is that I would be able to prove whether someone opened that file or not, right? I'd be able to, let's say, have a central kind of log of where it would tell me, hey, Alice opened this file, Nancy opened this file on this date on this device, and then I'd be able to see that, maybe John Doe, who just found my phone in the bar, wasn't able to open the file on this device and prove that. So that would be I think, the ideal type of solution, right? Where even if these data losses, they're not going away, right? I mean, it's very hard. You can't chain the smartphone to your employees' clothes, right? So this is a fact of life that we just need to live with, and then we need to find ways through encryption, of course, and audit trails and other tools that will make sure that if when this occurs, and it will, that the sensitive protected health information is not being compromised.
Yes, absolutely. And healthcare is not the only industry in which this is a problem, obviously, but you know, the tricky part about healthcare is that we're talking about patient health information. We're talking about sort of sensitive data and information. I mean, nobody wants to lose their phone. You know, God knows what would happen if I lost my phone today, how much information would be waylaid. But from a protection standpoint, that patient health information is very sensitive. And, you know, hackers and people who get a hold of it have all kinds of exciting things that they can do with patient health information. We have learned, and that is, you know, that causes a higher level of concern.
I agree, and I think, by the way, I don't know if, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that I don't know if any of the audience saw, I think in the last week or two there were a bunch of reports in the national media about how patient health information is worth actually a lot more than, you know, just normal kind of social security numbers and credit card numbers, and that hackers are specifically trying to kind of gain access to that of that data. And the reason is that, you know, patient health information stays with us for our entire lives. And so, you know, even if you switch providers, or, I mean, your health information is going to be the same. So, so it actually has a greater value in kind of the black market of hackers than normal personal information. I think that's why, you know, our industry has to be even more careful.
Absolutely. And you have some particular insight into this example. There's a little history here of some breach activity at Stanford Hospital. You want to give us just a little bit of background on this and what your observations are?
Yeah, no, so, you know, so we're located in the Bay Area in California, and I went to Stanford, so this is something that actually kind of affected me as a patient. And I just wanted to highlight here, this is a good example, right, of a particular covered entity and the problems that they've had with HIPAA. So they've had 5 major breaches in the last years. You can actually, it's all public, so you can actually find this data online. And what I found really interesting is that, you know, 4 out of the 5 were on account exactly of what we're talking about, of lost devices, right? In this case, laptops. And again, if we tie this back to this whole cloud discussion, you know, this is a big problem. This is a real problem for this organization, right? Because they have these mobile devices, these laptops, and there's a tremendous amount of patient information lying around on them, and they need to figure out how to make sure that, you know, when employees lose these devices, they won't get breached. And then the 5th breach here, the extra one, right, is also interesting because it was exactly ties into the problem we talked about earlier, where there was an accidental posting of a lot of patient data online on a public website, which is again that problem of what happens when you're trying to share data externally, but you have to do that in a way that is safe. Even if you're going to use a web-based service, you have to make sure that, of course, that data doesn't leak onto a public website. So I think the particular case of Stanford actually highlights a lot of all these issues that we've talked about so far.
Absolutely, and you know, and over and over again, we are hearing about practices and sites launching these lovely patient portals, which we like and seem to be very secure, but it does push a lot of individual information out into the ether and out into the cloud, and you know, kind of understanding how that works, and so, you know, making sure that that information, once it's been distributed through those portals, is continuing to be safe as well. Just so much growth and change in this industry, I think, is affecting a lot of these potential breach problems.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, so from your perspective, what are you seeing are the primary sort of cloud sharing, file sharing issues with HIPAA?
Sure. So I think it's kind of reiterating what we talked about earlier, but I think the #1 issue today is still device loss. I mean, historically, that's just been the greatest cause of breaches. There's more devices now. There's more data on each device. So, I mean, we can clearly it would be a fairly safe prediction that that lots of smartphones, tablets, laptops with a lot of protected health information is going to continue and even increasingly be the biggest source of HIPAA breaches. And the second one is yes, this accidental sharing of protected health information online. Even if you're using the most secure service, it's really easy to make a mistake. With something like Dropbox or Box or Google, with 2 clicks of a button, I can accidentally share an entire directory tree with someone who's not authorized to see it. And even more so, right, once I share that directory tree, even if the person I shared with is authorized, they can share it onwards, right? So my medical billing provider might accidentally share it with someone they're not supposed to, which is kind of this loop sharing problem that we see a lot. So these are the two top HIPAA file sharing risks.
I agree. Obviously, we see a lot of reports of this in our various programs and through our audience communications. So figuring out solutions to this will be critical, I think, as this industry morphs and changes. And then on the file sharing side, what are the primary risks?
Yeah, so I think there's a third risk here, right, which is actually the one that gets a lot of the attention, and it's important as well, right? That question of people ask themselves is, what happens to my data if it's on the cloud, right? Like if I use something like Dropbox or Box, how do I make sure that it's safe on their servers? Now, actually, I would say, it's an important problem, but that's becoming less of a concern because these companies actually all have very expensive security teams in place, and they're aware that their services are being used not just to store cat photos, but also to store patient photos. And so arguably, over time, we think that the third problem is going to be less and less of a concern, even though it's getting a lot of the attention in the press. But actually, the first two are the ones that are going to be much more critical for organizations to solve, because those are really the hard problems to solve. The third problem, if you have a very strong, if Dropbox, and they do have a very strong security team, and they're very worried, of course, it impacts their bottom line if they get breached or if one of their employees violates, HIPAA. So of course, they have a very strong incentive to solve the third problem on their own, and they can.
Great. Well, obviously, the concerns are only mounting over time in terms of all of these items, and we are starting to get some questions from the audience that I want to make sure we make time for as you kind of get into this level of detail. But let's kind of move forward here, and then we'll see if we can get into some of these additional questions. In this particular slide, you're talking about how the business associates are solving some of these problems. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think the business associate agreement is a very important, right? It kind of guarantees that the business associate is actually meeting HIPAA, and I think it does solve the third problem, right? So if you look at, and we'll talk about this, but services like Box and Google Drive will sign business associate agreements with you that will take care of the third bullet. But if we, the problem with business associate agreements is that they won't take care of the first two bullets, right? So what these services will do, they'll say, as long as the data is on our servers on the cloud, we can make sure it's safe. But if one of your employees accidentally shares data with someone they're not supposed to, or if you lose a device that has a lot of our data on it, there's nothing we can do to prevent a HIPAA breach in that case. So the BAA is really only addressing kind of the third part here, which is what happens to the data on the cloud itself.
Right, indeed, and we do have a couple of questions kind of coming in about that as it relates to, whether or not those business associate agreements are in place for these various services, these cloud backup and sync services that we're talking about. So we will get to that in a moment because there are some issues around that. So this is a good slide for that, isn't it? Let's talk a little bit about that business associate agreement concept and these various services and kind of how they're reacting to that, and why do you think?
Sure. So I think this is just kind of a comparison between the three major services. So let's just go through a few points here, right? The first point is the business associate agreement. So Google Drive and Box indeed sign business associate agreements with their paying customers, or they may sign them. They're willing to sign them. Again, the one thing I would caution about that is it's great that you can get a business associate agreement with them, but it really still doesn't solve your two biggest problems, which is what happens with all that Google Drive data on my tablet that is sitting unencrypted, or what happens if I share with my medical billing company or accidentally share with someone I'm not supposed to. So that's just something that we really need to be aware of. On the side of the device, and that's kind of what we talked about, none of these services offer any protection, right? So all of these services, basically, once the data leaves the cloud and gets downloaded and synchronized to all of your devices, it's unencrypted and unprotected. It's your responsibility, basically, to make sure that the data on the tablet or on the laptop is protected. All of these services have some provisions for preventing accidental sharing, so you can set permission on folders and stuff like that. But it's, inherently, if you share someone with someone else, it's really hard to guarantee what happens to that data after it's been shared. It's kind of outside of your domain of control at that minute. So you can try to, make sure that you share with the right people, but after you share with them, you have no way to still control the data. Similarly, I was talking about permission. Once the device is the data is downloaded to the device, there's really no permissions to it, right? So there's no way to, none of these services really can guarantee that if the data is downloaded to a laptop or to a phone, that I can set certain permissions or prevent unauthorized people from viewing it. And I think finally, so from an end user experience perspective, and this is something that I think we should still really be cognizant of, Dropbox is a much larger service than the other two, much more popular. And I think there's a reason for that. And the reason is that it's at least we've seen with our customers that it's simply much easier to use. It's kind of a very simple, intuitive service. The synchronization capabilities of Dropbox, I think, have kind of been established as superior than Box and Google. And it's really easy just to, you put a file in the folder and it appears on all your computers. And so ease of use, of course, is important because that's the primary reason for using any of these services. Finally, just in terms of popularity, I think, so popularity is important. You should actually be looking at, I would urge you to, when you adopt a file sharing service, don't go for the less popular ones. There's a big advantage in going with a ubiquitous service, and the reason is because when you're going to share with someone external, for example, so if you are going to be using the service to share with your medical billing provider, or if you're going to be rolling out the service among your entire team, today there's a much higher likelihood that that person, that your team member or that external provider is either already using Dropbox in their personal life or in their professional life. And so they'll already be familiar with its functionality, or they may already have an account set up. And so that's, I think, a big advantage of Dropbox, a lesser advantage also of Google Drive, but that's, I think, where Box kind of has a disadvantage because it's only used in very large organizations. It's really not become as widespread as the other two services. And so that's also something I think that you really need to take into account when you adopt one of these services.
Well, and for another reason, just, spending many years in the tech industry, I will just note that particularly for important services like this, something where you're going to be storing important information for yourself, signing on with small, newer services, in the beginning, sure, your own photographs or something like that, fine, but, for something important and critical data, I always worry that, those young companies aren't going to last particularly long, or going to get gobbled up by another bigger company, and in those cases, then you've got to deal with how those records are transferred and where they're transferred to, and whether or not the new service that gobbled them up has the same level of security and that sort of thing. So, from my perspective, that recommendation I think is always good, particularly when you're talking about sensitive data.
Okay, I think in the case of these three services, all of them are, Dropbox and Box are going to IPO probably very soon, and Google, of course, is Google. So I think all three of them are not, kind of small newcomers to the field. They're all fairly established. But I agree, that's a concern. If you're looking at other services besides these three, it's definitely worth kind of thinking about that, what you just mentioned, that consideration.
Yeah, exactly. And so for our audience, who obviously is partly on this session to figure out how to make sure that any file sharing and any cloud access they do for their patient records and other important information is HIPAA compliant, what is it that they need to be aware of?
Right. So, so far we've really talked mostly about the risks. And so now I'm happy to share a little bit about how you could actually, try to address them. So we've identified really three main ingredients. So, if we were to find a ideal solution for this problem, how would that look like? So the first ingredient is, the magic word encryption. But what encryption really means here is it's not only encryption for your data on the cloud, it's really even more so encryption for your data on the device. So you want to be able to make sure that, again, when that device is lost, the person that finds it, and there's going to be data on that device, there's nothing pretty much you can do about that, there's going to be sensitive data, at least let's make sure that that data is encrypted and that the person that found it basically can't do anything with it. It's kind of unreadable to the person that found it. And so that's really what encryption achieves. The second important ingredient is access control. And so, and this is kind of part of the underlying idea behind HIPAA is that, authorized people should be able to access data, and unauthorized people should be prevented from accessing data. And so what we would like in an ideal world is basically to have a whitelist, right? You want to be able to have a set of people that you trust, let's say within your organization, that if they get a hold of the data, let's say shared by the file sharing service, they would be able to open it and be able to block access for anybody else outside either your organization or the trusted people also outside your organization. And you need to be able to make changes to that list pretty much in real time, right? So if one of your employees is leaving the company or gets separated, you need to be able to remove them from that list. If you're going to change from one radiologist to another in another hospital, again, you need to be able to remove one of them and add the other one in real time and grant them access to the data. And the same thing is true for devices. So if one of your employees loses a device or switches to a device, you need to be able to decommission or block access to the sensitive data on that device immediately. The third important ingredient is audit trails, right? And so audit trails really, what they let you do is track data. They let you know, was my data, who accessed my data, when, and on what device. And I think that the audit trail, so some of these companies have audit trails, but they're only going to be for the data on the cloud. They have no way to maintain audit trails on the device itself. And that's, of course, really important. You need to be able to know, on this particular laptop, who opened a file, when did they open it, and was this laptop breached. And similarly, emergency access. If you're going to have a team of people that are going to be using these cloud services, you need to make sure that, if one of them is offline or is on vacation, for example, that the admin can always be able to retrieve the data and grant it to a patient that wants it in case of an emergency.
Agreed, and I think that's a piece, that third item in particular is something that I think very few people realize is potentially available or understand how that would work. So how would you say that the compliant file sharing services are going to address those particular outstanding concerns?
Right. So if we had if we had these three ingredients that I was talking about before, then they would actually fully address these concerns, right? Because so if we have file encryption on the device, and I can prevent access to unauthorized people through encryption, what that means is if I lose a device with a Dropbox account that has a lot of data on it, I'll be protected because the person who finds it just won't be able to open the data. Similarly, if I have a way to control who can access the data through a whitelist, even if I accidentally share PHI on Google Drive with someone I'm not supposed to, that person won't be able to open any of the files because I've set a whitelist of people that only those particular people can access the data. Similarly, if someone continuously shares my data with someone else, like my medical billing provider accidentally shares it with someone completely unrelated, again, if I have permissions on those files that only my medical billing company is able to open that data, then even if they share it onwards, that data won't be able to be read. And finally, the third component, the unencrypted, protected health information on the cloud part, I mean, that is also solved because if I have end-to-end encryption of files, now you don't need to, in parentheses, trust your cloud provider anymore, because even the cloud provider can't access the data because it's encrypted. So even if they store all the data for you, because the data is encrypted, none of their employees, or if some can open it, or if someone hacks into Google, they won't be able to access the data because it would be encrypted. So in that sense, all three of these major risks would be solved with that type of, with those types of guarantees.
And so, you know, obviously you're coming from a particular group that has gone a long way to solving some of the problems as it relates to these services and HIPAA compliance. Talk a little bit about that and kind of how what you folks are doing improves upon the idea of file sharing and allows the users of Dropbox and some of these other services to feel more confident that what they're doing in terms of their file sharing is protected.
Sure. So my company, Sookasa, is really, what we do is really those three ingredients that we talked about. So we partnered with Dropbox, and we basically offer a service of kind of file encryption and security that makes sure that your data is encrypted anywhere it goes. So even if it's downloaded to devices or shared externally, through a simple kind of whitelist, you can basically guarantee that only a specific set of people and a specific set of devices can access that data, and you can change that list kind of at any time. And so with a combination of Sookasa and Dropbox, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds, right? So we would sign a BA with you, which gives you that, which again is very important. Dropbox wouldn't have to because they don't even access the data because all the data is encrypted on their servers. We offer the on-device encryption part, so the data basically, no matter what latest and greatest device your employees will bring to the office, you know, if the latest iOS or Android device, the files are always going to be encrypted. So when they will reach that device, in essence, the data is going to be secure on that device. So you don't need to deal with any kind of device encryption or hardware encryption types of solutions. With Sookasa, you can prevent accidental sharing because, again, even if someone accidentally shares with someone they're not supposed to, if that person does not appear on the Sookasa whitelist, they simply won't be able to access the data. And then there's full access control for data on the device. So even after the data has been stored on your laptop, you know, you can at any time revoke access to it and make sure that, you know, if one of the employees leaves the company, for example. And then I think what we've worked on a lot, and part of the reason we partnered with Dropbox as the first cloud provider that we offer, is because Dropbox is really we think the set the standard for end user experience. And so a lot of our work has been around how do we just preserve the Dropbox experience so that your end users they basically still interact with Dropbox. They don't really notice that we're there in the background. And then you can really leverage the great features of Dropbox, like sharing and synchronization and backup on all the different devices, including mobile. And finally, and also kind of leveraging their popularity in that sense. So, you know, you can share with your medical billing provider or with that other organization that may already be using Dropbox, and you don't have to switch to a new system with them. You can continue using the system that they're used to, that they love, but just add an extra layer of security on top of it. So that's kind of it on us. I mean, and if any of you have other questions about that, of course, I'd be very happy to answer them or stay in touch.
Well, actually, interestingly, one of the questions we do have, and we will start getting to these questions a little bit as we're getting into the last, 10 minutes or so here. One of the questions was that, and this was before you addressed that particular slide, but was that there are some smaller companies that are specifically geared toward file sharing and HIPAA compliance. I assume as an industry player you're aware of those services. And what's your thought in terms of, I know you mentioned that you feel like the end user experience is a component. What's your thought as it relates to the difference between those smaller services and what you guys do?
Sure. So I'm assuming that you're kind of referring more to kind of Dropbox alternatives that are HIPAA compliant, or Box alternatives that are HIPAA compliant. I hope that's kind of what the question is about, if I understand correctly. Yeah, there are a few smaller industry players. I don't know if you guys have heard of maybe Watchdogs. There's a company called Spider Oak. I think the problem. So again, I'm we're not a file sharing provider, so we only provide a layer of security on top of file sharing. So so we're fairly neutral in this sense. What we've seen is that building a service that does file sharing and synchronization is actually really tough. Like what Dropbox have built has required a lot of years of work, and it's not a coincidence that they're the most popular. And so I think that at the end the industry is converging on a small number of popular file sharing services. I think the list is going to, at the end, that the major players are going to there's going to be less and less major players, and there's going to be consolidation. And so I think at the end, Dropbox has big advantages over these services, just in terms of ease of deployment, ease of setup. And so that's really why we saw the need to support them and add that extra layer of security. And we didn't feel like any of the existing smaller players were really providing both the necessary security and file sharing. I would also say one extra thing is there's a difference between encryption and compliance. There's always been a lot of solutions out there that offered, let's say, on drive encryption or on-device encryption. But the main technical problem when you're building a solution like that is how do you enable, let's say, simple sharing, right? Like how do you share data and maintain that it's still encrypted? And so I think from what I can tell, a lot of these services still haven't really cracked that problem well. Like how do you share data in a simple way? So those are the things I would look at. But of course, I would probably recommend take a look at a few of these services. It's all really easy. It's really easy to sign up to them, and you can basically run your own test. That's I think the beauty of the cloud is that you don't need an IT person to come and install them just for testing them out, and you can do it on your own. And most of them have free versions as well. So.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. One last question. A number of the questions that came through, you actually answered in your presentation or at some point in our Q&A back and forth with each other. One question, though, I thought was interesting was somebody asked that between the cloud-based services and server-based backup services, I think you addressed this somewhat in talking about kind of the per-seat costs for the backup and synchronization, but this particular person is wondering which one of those two choices is going to be more cost-effective and administrative friendly.
So I think you can probably run your own kind of back-of-the-envelope cost estimate, right? But it's from what I've seen at least, it's very hard to beat the cloud file sharing kind of solutions, right? I mean, so if let me just give you an example, right? Like if let's say you're looking at Dropbox in our service. So at Dropbox have various pricing points, but as I said, they're let's say between $100 and $200 per year. We would add another $100 per year on top of that. So you're looking at let's say between $200 and $300 per year per person. Just setting up your own server, maintaining it, not even talking about the licensing fees that you would incur. And also making sure that your backup server, you probably have to buy, the HIPAA, something that is HIPAA compliant, and you may need to get it certified. From what we've talked to our own customers, that can be in the thousands of dollars per seat per year. And then I think the main problem is going to be that in 2 years, that server is probably either going to become too small or not enough capacity or too slow to deal with all the data that's just getting multiplied with all these different with all the digital services that we all use. And so what I think that one of the biggest advantages of the cloud, which is sometimes overlooked, is that if you look at something like Dropbox, they update their service on a weekly basis, right? When you're signing up to their service, you're getting updates. You're not even noticing that their application is updated. And they will continue to update it. It's kind of like within the cost of that subscription, you're getting unlimited upgrades. When you're starting to maintain your own servers, the real cost comes, I think, not at necessarily even the first installation, but the cost of maintaining it and then migrating data and making sure your operating system is running the latest one with Windows XP and so forth. And so I think that's where the cloud is going to have an even bigger advantage over time.
No, I absolutely agree. And just for clarity, in some of the questions that I'm seeing, Sookasa, the product that Saf is talking about today, that Sookasa product is kind of a partner product or an add-on, as it were, to the box experience. Is that correct, Seth?
Correct. Yeah. So we're a startup, but we've already so we're basically today we offer an add-on for Dropbox that makes it that makes sure that your files are HIPAA compliant on Dropbox and on all of your devices and enables sharing. We will be actually, so our next service that we'll support is we'll start supporting web email services like Gmail. So that's kind of the next big one for us. And in general, we plan to support all major platforms eventually. But we already have several hundred healthcare companies that are our customers, and we've been growing very fast in the industry. So that's kind of just a little bit about us.
Well, thank you very much, Seth, for joining us today for this Learning Lunch. We appreciate it. Obviously, this is a topic of interest and a growing topic of concern among medical sites. To learn more about how that Sookasa product works with Dropbox, you've got a URL on the screen there, which is sookasa.com, S-O-O-K-A-S-A, something important to kind of check out if this is a concern for you. I'd like to thank all of our attendees. Remember that all registered attendees will receive an email with links to both recorded and PDF versions of this slideshow and session. As you all know, Format Approved offers robust online education for HIPAA, for the compliance officer level as well as the staff level at formattraining.com. Visit Format Approved to learn more about our upcoming learning lunches. We run these free on a regular basis. That learning lunch button on our homepage will take you to the registration page. It'll also take you to the page where you can download prior sessions about HIPAA. God knows we do HIPAA content sessions on a very regular basis. If this is an area of concern for you, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel and our archive of learning lunches. And keep an eye on your email box and our homepage for other upcoming topics. And thank you again for joining us today. And thanks again.
Thanks, Wendy.